Year 3. This video is to help you with today's science activity as part of your home learning. So give the description of the activity a good read first, and then you can use, there's a few things that I've put together for you to use to help you with it. So there's this video is here to help you, and I've also put together some sheets. I've done a question sheet, it's called Science Experiment Question Sheet. There's another sheet which is very similar, but it uses slightly more of the scientific terminology, so the vocabulary that scientists use when they do their own experiments, and gives a little bit more description about what that terminology means, and it's got slightly less or fewer like sentence starters and things like that to help you. So you can use a question sheet, which would be fine, or you can use the investigation sheet. Doesn't matter which one, so you can have a look at them both, decide which one you're going to use. Okay. You could, when you're doing this experiment, you don't need to print anything off, you don't need to print off the investigation sheets, but you could record your findings in your workbook using what's on the question sheet or the investigation sheet to help you. You could do that. Or you could not do that. You don't have to write it all down, and you could just talk to the person that you're doing this experiment with and think about the questions and talk about it and say it out loud. So you're sort of your work is being done verbally and practically. The other thing, so there's the video, there's the 2 blank sheets to help you, and then there's also my sheet. So I filled in the investigation sheet myself, and that is there for you to look at as well. You could look at that as you go along to see what I did, or you could have a go at it yourself first and use that at the end, or you could just save it for like anything in particular that you find a bit tricky and get stuck with. But the rest of this video is going to be talking through each section on those sheets, explaining what it means, and then talking about what I would do for my experiment. So you can just watch the whole video and then have a go at the whole experiment yourself. Or as you go along, after I've explained what each section means, you could pause it and have a go at each section. And if you wanted to, you could pause it before I start to say what I would fill in on that section of the sheet, or in that section of my write-up of my scientific investigation. So if you want to, at any point in the video, you can just press pause and have a think and think, okay, so what do I think the answer to that is, or what would I write down or do in my experiment at this stage? So yeah, it's a flexible activity. You can do it in lots of different ways, and I'm going to talk a little bit more now about each step of our investigation. Now, what we are doing today is becoming scientists to conduct our own scientific investigation. And when scientists do that, what they do is come up with a question that they would like to find out the answer to, that they can then investigate. So the first thing to do with any scientific experiment is come up with your question. I'm not asking you to come up with your own question today. We're all going to start with the same question, which is, what is the most effective way to wash your hands? Variables. So the word variable comes from the word vary, which means to change. So variables are things that can change. So that if you're conducting an experiment with lots of different people, one of their variables might be the age that all those different people are. That's something that can change. It could be feelings, it could be something physical. Variables are things that you can measure in an experiment that vary, that might change. In a science experiment, we've got 2 different kinds of variables. We've got independent variables and we've got dependent variables. So an independent variable is a variable that stands on its own, because that's what independent means. So an independent variable is not changed by other variables. So it's not changed by other things going on. So like I said, if we were doing an experiment with people, their age would be an independent variable because their age is not going to change, and we're not going to be able to change their age, are we? So it's something that is not going to change. Not going to be affected by other things going on in the experiment. That's an independent variable. In a when we're doing a science experiment, it's so important to keep it a fair test, okay? So we need it to be a fair test. The way that we do that is only changing one thing. Mario class, I know we've done a lot of work on that. We're only going to change one thing. So we're going to keep as many of the independent variables as we can the same and try and replicate those. So when we're testing out different ways of washing our hands, we want to keep it all the same and just change one thing. So have a little think in our experiment, what are we going to have to change and what are we going to have to try and keep the same? Now, when you're washing your hands, when we're doing this experiment of washing our hands, we are going to need to use some hands. So that's one variable, one independent variable, whose hands are being washed. What's on your hands? So we've talked about maybe using something like ketchup, okay, so that would be another independent variable. And the other thing is how you are washing your hands. So have a little think, whose hands are being washed, what's on the hands, and how the hands are being washed. Out of those three things, which one do you think is going to be the thing that we change? And you can pause the video and have a little think about it, or talk to your grown-up about it if you want. So out of those three things, the thing that we are going to change is how we're washing our hands, isn't it? Because that's the thing that we want to measure. We want to measure the impact of how we're washing our hands to see what the most effective one is. So that's what we're going to change. So now we need to think about how we're going to change it. I have come up with a list of different ways that you can wash your hands. I've thought about different things that you could use to wash your hands, different ways that you could do it, like different things that you can do with your hands to wash it. And I was trying to think about all the different ways that I know people or children clean their hands and wash their hands to try and find out which way is the most effective. So you can use my ideas, or you can use your own ideas if you want. Maybe you want to test out what kind of soap is the most effective, or you want to, you think of different methods that you might use. The ones that I have come up with are on my example of the investigation sheet, and I'm going to talk you through them now. Okay, so number one, we've got using hand sanitizer. Now, hand sanitizer is something that a lot of people are using at the moment, and it can be really useful, but I would like to know if that is the most effective way to wash your hands or not. Number two, just using water. No soap, just using water. And I'm going to split that into two different sections. So just using water and doing like a light scrub on your hands like that, or just using water and following steps to make sure that you're washing your hands more thoroughly. So scrubbing them lightly or scrubbing them really thoroughly and doing like the fronts and then the backs and then in between the fingers and the fingernails like that and the thumbs and the wrists, okay? And I'm going to put up a instruction chart that you sometimes see in public bathrooms or in toilets or in school toilets and out and about, and often you'll see that in doctors' surgeries or hospitals, like a set of instructions of different steps to wash your hands thoroughly. Okay, so those are the two different techniques that we're going to be investigating, that I'm going to in my experiment, to find out the most effective way to wash our hands. So light scrubbing or really thorough scrubbing following those steps. So I'm going to do those two things. So hand sanitizer, just with water, doing light scrubbing, just with water, doing thorough scrubbing, and then using water and soap. But I'm going to split that further into different categories, because what I notice as a teacher who sees lots of children washing their hands, like at snack time or other times of the day, I notice that sometimes what people do, children, but I'm sure, maybe there are adults who do it as well, that they put their soap on and then they rinse their hands under the tap. And the other way to do it is to, and then do all of the scrubbing. But the other way to do it would be to put your soap on and scrub before you put your hands back under the tap. Does that make sense? So you've got using water and soap, rinsing your hands before you do all of your scrubbing. So that could be light scrubbing, or it could be really thorough scrubbing, or water and soap, but you do all of the scrubbing, light scrubbing or thorough scrubbing, before you rinse your hands again. Okay, so those are my I've actually got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I've got 7 different ways of washing my hands there to test. You don't have to do that many. You could pick 2 things, washing my hands with water and washing my hands with soap and water. That would be a really good experiment to out of those 2 techniques, which is the most effective way. Or you could be a bit more detailed and use all of the categories that I've used. It's completely up to you. So we've got our question, what's the most effective way to wash our hands? We've got our independent variables, the ones that we know are not going to change, like the whose hands they are, what you're putting on your hands, and then we've got our independent variable that is the only one we're going to change, which is how we wash our hands. And by just changing how we wash our hands and keeping what's on our hands and who's doing the washing and whose hands they are the same, that is going to be how we keep it a fair test. Okay, dependent variables, that's the other kind of variable, and that is the variable that depends on other factors. Okay, dependable variable depending on the other things. So this is the one that is going to help you answer your question, our question of what's the most effective way to wash our hands when we measure it. So it's what we're going to measure. So have a little think. So we're washing our hands in all these different ways. What are we going to measure? What are we going to look at to see how well our hands have been washed? What are we going to do? What can we look at to tell us? What can we measure to tell us whether or how effective that method of hand washing was? We're going to look at how much is left on our hands. Okay, so you've got your dependent variable as well. Then you've got your hypothesis. Now, a hypothesis is a scientific word for a prediction or a guess at what you're going to find out by conducting this experiment. Okay, so what do you think is going to happen? Now, when you answer your hypothesis, when you write your hypothesis, instead of saying, I think that this is going to be the, like picking which method you think is going to be the best, the most effective, instead of just saying, I think that it will be most effective to wash your hands like this, that and the other, instead of saying that, what I want you to do is talking about the results. What result do you think you're going to see in terms of that dependent variable, which is how much is left on your hands after you have finished washing them? Okay, so my hypothesis, and you can pause it if you want to write your own first, if you want to have a think about what your hypothesis is going to be before you hear what mine is. My hypothesis might be the least amount of ketchup will be left on my hands after I wash them using soap and water and thorough scrubbing before I rinse them. Okay, so I've been really specific there about which method I think is going to show me the least amount of ketchup left on my hands. So that's the result, that's what the outcome is going to be of my experiment. But I don't know that for sure yet because I've not done my experiment yet. So it's just a hypothesis. It's just a guess, a prediction of what I'm going to see. Then you've got your results. So before you fill in this step, before you fill in your results, you need to actually go and do the experimenting. You need to go and wash your hands in all those different ways and measure by looking at how much is left on them, how effective all of those ways are. Then you can write down what your results are or tell someone or say what your results are. And again, I don't want you to use the language of the most effective way was. Yeah, I don't want you to say that because that's going to come later with our conclusion. Okay, so I want you again to talk about how much ketchup was left on the hands or how much whatever was left on your hands after you washed them. So you could start sentences with the most ketchup was left on my hands when, or the least ketchup was left on my hands when. And then you get to make your conclusion. Okay, so that is, you've done all of your experiment, you've got your data there, you've got your results. what are you going to conclude from that? What are you now going to be able to state about an effective way to wash your hands? So your conclusion is probably going to start with something like the most effective way to, and then you can say what the most effective way to wash your hands was. I would love to, and Mrs. Hortler and Mrs. Ablethorpe would love as well, to hear what the results of your experiments were, and maybe see some photos if you wanted to take some photos of your hands covered in stuff, and then the results of washing them. As we know, washing our hands is very important. It keeps us safe and healthy. But by conducting this experiment, you are being scientists and you are able to investigate questions and draw out findings and make conclusions from that, which is a really brilliant skill to have. Okay, so happy experimenting. Go and investigate and find things out and let us know what you find. Let us know if you've got any questions, and we will see you soon.